In the flickering gaslight of a London fog, where shadows clung to cobblestones like unspoken sins, the Victorian age unfolded, not as the pinnacle of progress we so often celebrate, but as a grand theatre of the macabre. Forget the polished portraits of empire and invention, the triumphant narratives of steam and steel. This was the era history preferred to veil in lace and propriety, a time when the air itself seemed heavy with the scent of decay, where every advancement whispered of mortality, and the living danced perilously close to the grave. Beneath the rigid corsets and ironclad morals lay a world obsessed with death, dismemberment, and the grotesque, a paradox of enlightenment shadowed by an unrelenting fascination with the abyss. Imagine it. The year 1837. A young queen ascends the throne, amid the clamour of industrial hammers, her realm stretching across oceans, yet riddled with cholera-choked alleys and workhouses that devoured the poor like insatiable beasts. Progress marched forward on the backs of the broken, railways slicing through ancient earth, while graveyards overflowed with the unburied. The Victorians, those paragons of decorum, filled their parlours with post-mortem photographs, their literature with vampires and resurrections, their medicine with vivisections that blurred the line between healer and hangman. It was an age that built museums to catalogue human bones, that turned public executions into festive spectacles, where the elite sipped tea while orphans toiled in factories that ground flesh into profit. And in this duality, the gleaming facade of civilization masking a heart pulsing with horror, lies the true enigma of the Victorian era. How could a society so devoted to order produce such profound, pervasive darkness? This documentary will peel back those layers of varnish, exposing the era not as a mere footnote of triumph, but as the darkest, most macabre chapter in modern history. We will journey through its shadowed corridors, from the fog-shrouded streets of industrial hells to the opulent drawing rooms haunted by spiritualism's ghosts. Why did death become a daily companion, woven into fashion, fiction, and family life? How did the empire's global reach feed a domestic appetite for the exotic and the eerie, from shrunken heads in curiosity cabinets to the opium dens that blurred waking nightmares? And what psychological undercurrents, repressed desires, class warfare, the terror of rapid change, turned propriety into a brittle shell over a seething cauldron of the uncanny? Our path begins at the dawn of Victoria's reign, tracing the geopolitical fractures that birthed this behemoth of contradictions. We will delve into the early years, where childhood was no sanctuary but a forge of fragility, marked by famines, epidemics, and the unyielding grip of poverty that shaped souls as surely as it scarred bodies. From there, the rise unfolds in relentless detail. The core cataclysms of industry and empire, the Crimean bloodbaths and Indian famines that stained the sceptre red, the Jack the Ripper shadows that exposed the underbelly of urban terror. We will dissect the scandals, the baby farmers who traded in infant corpses, the anatomists who robbed graves under moonless skies, recreating the forensic intensity of each pivotal horror, from the match girls' strike that ignited with phosphorus burns to the Burke and Hare resurrectionists who supplied fresh cadavers to eager surgeons. As the narrative deepens, we turn inward, exploring the philosophical pivot from raw brutality to a haunted introspection, where Darwin's revelations cracked open the casket of certainty, birthing existential dreads that fueled Gothic revivals and seances. The era's inner evolution reveals a society grappling with its own monstrosity, channeling macabre obsessions into art and reform, yet never fully escaping the spectre of decline. Finally, we confront the legacy, how Sherlock Holmes and Bram Stoker immortalized the Victorian psyche in ink and shadow, influencing everything from modern horror to our lingering unease with mortality. Academic debates rage on. Was it progress or pathology. Misconceptions abound, from the myth of unyielding prudery to the sanitized view of empire as benevolent. And in our closing reflections, we will linger on the paradox that endures. In seeking to conquer death through science and sentiment, the Victorians only amplified its whisper, a lesson in the fragility of human ambition that echoes through our own veiled darkness. Now, as the curtain rises on this forgotten tableau, settle into the dim glow of your screen. Let the fog roll in, carrying the distant toll of factory bells and the sigh of wind through iron gates. This is no sanitized history. It's an invitation to walk the era's haunted paths, to feel the chill of its secrets seeping through the cracks. Join me, if you dare, in unraveling why the Victorian age, for all its grandeur, remains the most profoundly macabre epoch we have known. Breathe deeply. The air is thick with the past, and it hungers to be remembered. The foundations of this darkness were laid long before Victoria's crown touched her brow, in the seismic upheavals of the late 18th century that reshaped Europe into a powder keg of revolution and reaction. The French guillotines had fallen silent by 1815, but their echoes reverberated across the Channel, fueling Britain's dread of radicalism and its iron-fisted response. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo left the island nation as the unchallenged mistress of the seas, her empire ballooning from Canada's frozen frontiers to India's sun-baked plains, a web of colonies that promised wealth but delivered waves of exploited labor and suppressed uprisings. Geopolitics here was no abstract chessboard. It was the lifeblood of industry, with cotton from American slaves spun in Lancashire mills, opium forced upon China to balance trade deficits, fueling wars that the Victorians would later romanticize as civilizing missions. Yet beneath this imperial swagger pulsed a cultural worldview forged in Protestant rigor and Enlightenment rationalism, twisted by romantic excess into a peculiar brew. The Church, still dominant, preached divine order amid chaos, but its sermons rang hollow against the backdrop of enclosures that evicted rural folk, herding them into burgeoning cities like Manchester and Birmingham, urban infernos where the population exploded from 1 million in 1800 to over 6 by mid-century. Culture reflected this tension. Jane Austen's drawing-room civilities gave way to Dickens' grim caricatures of want, while the Gothic novel, birthed in Walpole's castles, evolved into a mirror for societal fears. Frankenstein's monster, not just a tale of hubris, but a prophecy of the mechanized horrors to come. The worldview was one of stark binaries: progress versus perdition, empire versus entropy. Science promised mastery over nature. Faraday's electromagnetism, Stephenson's locomotives, but it also unearthed fossils that mocked biblical timelines, stirring a crisis of faith that would haunt the era. Socially, the rigid class structure ossified further, with the middle classes rising on mercantile backs, enforcing a code of respectability that masked the brutality below. Child labor laws lagged decades behind the 12-hour shifts in coal pits, where the air choked with dust and despair. Women, confined to the angel-in-the-house ideal, navigated a world where their bodies were both idolized and pathologized. Corsets cinching waists to perilous inches, while hysteria treatments veered into the invasive and arcane. And woven through it all was the macabre thread, an obsession born of high mortality rates. Life expectancy hovered at 35 for the working poor, ravaged by tuberculosis that turned cheeks to hollows and lungs to graveyards. Death was omnipresent, not distant. Open sewers bred typhus. Workhouses became antechambers to pauper burials, and the Poor Laws of 1834 institutionalized suffering, denying relief to the able-bodied in a system that viewed poverty as moral failing. This era's geopolitics, then, was not just maps and treaties. It was the soil from which a uniquely Victorian morbidity grew, a society that built crystal palaces of glass and iron, yet populated them with spirits, seances, and a fervour for mourning jewellery crafted from the hair of the departed. The foundations were set, a world advancing at breakneck speed, yet forever glancing over its shoulder at the shadows lengthening behind. And that changed everything. To understand the macabre soul of the Victorian era, we must descend into its cradle, the early years of Queen Victoria's reign, from 1837 to the 1850s, when the seeds of darkness took root in the fragile forms of childhood itself. This was no idyllic dawn of empire, no nursery of gentle progress. It was a forge where innocence was hammered into something sharper, more haunted. Forget the myth of the merry old England peddled in later nostalgia, the sanitized tales of plucky urchins climbing social ladders through sheer pluck. The documented truths paint a far grimmer portrait. A generation born into a world that devoured its young, shaping psyches through unrelenting trauma, where every breath carried the tang of soot and every dawn promised not light, but the grind of survival. Here, in the origins of Victorian life, we uncover the psychological fractures that would echo through parlours and poorhouses alike. A childhood not of wonder, but of wary anticipation, where death lurked as intimately as a sibling's cough. Consider the raw facts pieced together from parish records, coroners' inquests, and the stark ledgers of workhouses. Infant mortality claimed 1 in 3 lives before the age of 5, a statistic born not of abstract fate, but of the era's brutal contradictions. In the teeming slums of Whitechapel or the mill towns of Yorkshire, babies arrived into homes where malnutrition was the norm, their tiny frames twisted by rickets from sunlight-starved tenements or poisoned by the arsenic-laced green wallpaper that peeled in damp corners. Mothers, often as young as 14, juggled factory shifts with breastfeeding, only to watch their offspring succumb to summer diarrhea, a euphemism for cholera's watery grip, spread through sewers that doubled as open gutters. The 1840s saw the Irish famine's ripples crash against Britain's shores, displacing hundreds of thousands into coffin ships that unloaded skeletons at Liverpool docks, their children herded into fever hospitals where the dead outnumbered the living. Trauma here was not episodic, it was the air they breathed, a constant undercurrent that bred a hypervigilance, a childhood worldview where joy was fleeting, snatched between bouts of fever and the overseer's lash. Psychologically, these early years forged souls in the fires of contradiction, cultural forces that preached domestic bliss while enforcing a Darwinian ruthlessness. The ideal of the family, enshrined in evangelical tracts and royal example, portrayed children as blank slates for moral inscription, yet reality inscribed them with scars. Victoria herself, ascending at 18, embodied this paradox. A girl queen plucked from Kensington Palace's cloistered isolation, her early diaries revealing a petulant isolation laced with foreboding, scribbled under the watchful eye of a domineering mother and a manipulative comptroller. Her marriage to Albert in 1840 was meant to model conjugal harmony, birthing 9 children in rapid succession, but even the royal nursery hid shadows, Prince Albert's hypochondria foreshadowing his early death. The Queen's confinements a ritual of regal suffering that trickled down to mimic in middle-class homes. For the masses, though, the cultural imperative was survival through submission. The 1833 Factory Act limited child labour to 9 hours for the under-9s, a reform that still condemned pauper apprentices to chimney-sweep sooty hells, their scalped knees and lung-blackened coughs a testament to the era's selective mercy. Delve deeper into the documented horrors, and the macabre emerges not as aberration, but as architecture. Take the case of the baby farmers, those entrepreneurial horrors of the 1840s and 50s, who advertised in penny papers as wet nurses for illegitimate infants, products of a society that shamed unwed mothers into secrecy. Women like Amelia Dyer, though her peak infamy came later, typified the early pattern, taking in babes for a fee, dosing them with opium-laced, soothing syrups until they stilled forever, their tiny bodies bundled into the Thames or buried in back gardens. Coroner's reports from London alone tally hundreds such cases by 1850, each a microcosm of cultural forces at play, the rigid morality that branded bastardy a sin, forcing desperate choices while poverty turned maternal instinct into commodity. Psychologically, this bred a generational wariness. Surviving children, orphaned or half-raised in foundling hospitals like the one at Coram's Fields, learned early that affection was transactional, love a luxury amid the era's emotional austerity. Contradictions abounded, too, in the educational forge that was meant to elevate, but often crushed. Ragged schools, philanthropist ventures for the street waifs, taught reading through Bible verses on obedience, yet the curriculum ignored the body's pleas. Children fainting from hunger during lessons, their minds sharpened by fear of the birch. For the middle classes, the early Victorian schoolroom was a pressure cooker of piety and propriety. Boys at Eton or Harrow endured fagging systems that normalized bullying as character building, while girls in seminaries like those of Miss Pinkerton internalized the doll's house fate, their psyches molded by novels that romanticized self-sacrifice. Trauma layered upon trauma. The 1842 Mines Act exposed the subterranean nightmares of child colliers, girls as young as 8, hauling coal naked in shafts too low to stand. Their testimonies to parliamentary commissions roar with the sensory horror, dripping blackness, rat-nibbled flesh, the perpetual echo of cave-ins that claimed siblings without ceremony. These origins, then, were no mere prelude. They were the psychological bedrock of Victorian morbidity, where cultural forces, evangelical zeal clashing with industrial exigency, imperial optimism undercut by domestic despair, imprinted a collective fragility. Children grew not into unscarred adults, but into a society that fetishized the childlike in art. Think Millie's drowned Ophelia, evoking lost innocence, while discarding the actual young as expendable. The early era's traumas echoed forward, turning personal loss into public obsession. Hair locks woven into brooches, death masks cast for the mantle. In this crucible the macabre was born, not imposed from without, but etched from within, a worldview where every advancement came laced with loss, every family portrait shadowed by an empty chair. And that changed everything, seeding the darkness that would bloom across the decades. From the scarred psyches of its youngest inhabitants, the Victorian era surged into its relentless ascent, a machinery of empire and industry that ground forward with the inexorable force of a locomotive devouring track. This was the rise, not a triumphant march, but a shadowed procession through cataclysms that etched the macabre into the very bones of society, from the blood-soaked fields of foreign wars to the festering underbelly of London's labyrinthine streets. We now enter the core of this darkness, dissecting the pivotal horrors with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, recreating the forensic intensity of each fracture point, the industrial infernos that consumed flesh for fuel, the imperial famines that hollowed continents, the urban phantoms, like Jack the Ripper, who turned the heart of empire into a slaughterhouse. These were no isolated tragedies. They were the era's beating pulse, a symphony of brutality that revealed the fragility beneath the corseted facade, where progress and perdition intertwined like veins in marble. Begin with the industrial cataclysm, that forge of the mid-century, where human cost was tallied in ledgers of profit and pain. By the 1850s, Manchester had swollen into a sooty colossus, its mills churning cotton into cloth at the price of lives. 13-hour days in Hades-like halls, where the air hung thick with lint and the clamour of looms drowned out cries. Picture it. The 1853 inquest into the Holmfirth mill fire, where flames erupted from an overlooked lantern, trapping 200 women and girls behind bolted doors to prevent idling. The official report, buried in parliamentary archives, details the horror with clinical detachment, bodies charred beyond recognition, twisted in eternal embraces, their screams silenced by the roar of collapsing beams. Over 80 perished, yet the coroner blamed carelessness, a verdict that masked the deeper truth. Owners like those of the Ashtons prioritized output over escape routes, turning workers into expendable cinders. Psychologically, this bred a collective numbness, survivors haunted by the scent of singed hair, their testimonies to Blue Ribbon Commissions raw with the sensory assault, the acrid smoke stinging eyes already blurred by perpetual dusk, the weight of fallen timbers crushing limbs like dry twigs. Deeper still, the Match Girls' strike of 1888 stands as a microcosm of industrial savagery, a slow-burning revolt against the phossy jaw that gnawed at the faces of the young women in Bryant's Bryant and May factory. White phosphorus, cheaper than the safer red variant, ignited spontaneously on trouser friction, but its true venom lay in the necrosis it wrought, jaws swelling green, teeth loosening in pus-filled sockets, breath reeking of gangrene as the bone dissolved. Medical journals from the era, like those in The Lancet, catalogue the cases with detached fascination. Girls as young as 14, their once pretty features contorted into masks of the grotesque, forced to continue dipping sticks until collapse. The strike erupted when Annie Besant exposed the plight in her radical pamphlet, igniting a conflagration of defiance. 700 women marched from the East End docks, their placards smeared with phosphorescent residue that glowed eerily in the fog. Forensic reconstruction from strike records reveals the brutality. Pickets beaten by hired thugs, leaders like Sarah Chapman jailed on trumped-up charges, their cells a foretaste of the workhouse chill. Yet victory came, partial and Pyrrhic. The firm conceded meagre reforms, but the jaw claimed dozens more before safer matches prevailed in the 1890s. This event, dissected in labor histories, exposed the era's paradox. A society that exalted the angel in the house while condemning her sisters to a living death, their disfigurements a macabre badge of resistance. Across the seas, the empire's rise amplified these domestic horrors into global abominations, none more visceral than the Indian famines of the 1870s, a deliberate catastrophe veiled in administrative euphemism. The Great Famine of 1876-1878, triggered by monsoon failures but exacerbated by British export policies, starved 10 million in the Madras Presidency alone, figures gleaned from Viceroy Lytton's dispatches, which prioritized grain shipments to England over relief. Imagine the scene pieced from eyewitness accounts in famine commission reports, skeletal figures shambling through Bengal's dust-choked villages, mothers abandoning infants by roadsides like discarded rags, the air alive with the buzz of flies over unburied heaps. Temples became charnel houses, where the devout resorted to cannibalism, whispered in colonial gazettes as degenerate custom, ignoring the root. Railways built for extraction funneled rice to ports, while locals queued for labor gangs at half rations. The psychological toll was profound, a cultural fracture that bred resentment etched in poetry like that of Ramesh Chandra Dutt, who decried the famine code as a blueprint for extermination. Forensic analysis of skeletal remains from mass graves, unearthed in later archaeological digs, shows not just starvation's hollow cheeks, but signs of violence, skulls cracked by tax collectors' lathis, enforcing payments amid the dying. This imperial machinery, oiled by the 1857 Sepoy Mutiny's reprisals, turned the sceptre into a scythe, feeding Britain's mills with blood-soaked cotton, while domestic parlours displayed ivory carvings from the same ravaged lands. No assent, however, crystallized the era's urban macabre like the Whitechapel murders of 1888. the Ripper's shadow that clawed at the empire's core. In the gaslit alleys of London's East End, where immigrants and prostitutes huddled in gin-soaked squalor, 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, were eviscerated with surgical precision, their bodies splayed in forensic tableaux that shocked even the hardened peelers. Autopsies, detailed in the inquest transcripts at the Old Bailey, reveal the killer's intimacy with anatomy. Uteri excised with a single stroke, intestines arranged like macabre garlands, faces mutilated to defy identification. The press frenzy, over 1 million pamphlets sold, turned the crimes into spectacle, yet the true horror lay in the societal rot exposed. Overcrowded doss houses where a bed cost 4pence, cholera from the Thames sewage, and a police force outmatched by the Fog's Vale. Psychological profiling, rudimentary then, but refined in modern criminology, suggests a perpetrator shaped by the era's repressions, perhaps a disgraced surgeon, his blade an outlet for the class hatred simmering in Whitechapel's breweries and sweatshops. The murders halted abruptly, leaving a void filled by copycats and conspiracy, but their legacy was the era's mirror. Prosperity for the few built on the discarded, where the Ripper was not aberration, but avatar of the invisible violence that stalked every shadow. These core events, the mill fire's infernos, the matchgirl's glowing decay, the famine's hollow marches, the Ripper's crimson artistry, propelled the Victorian rise into a crescendo of controlled chaos, each horror a thread in the tapestry of morbidity. Industry expanded, empire sprawled, yet the cost was a society scarred, its grandeur laced with the iron tang of blood. And that changed everything, tilting the balance toward an inner reckoning, where the external brutalities demanded a philosophical confrontation with the abyss within. As the machinery of empire and industry ground to a fevered pitch in the latter decades of the 19th century, a subtle fracture began to spiderweb through the Victorian edifice. A philosophical turning inward, where the era's unyielding brutalities, once externalized in blood and soot, recoiled upon the collective soul like a blade turned on its wielder. This was no abrupt enlightenment, no sudden shedding of shadows for the light of reason. It was a haunted introspection, a slow unraveling of certainties that exposed the fragility at the heart of progress. Darwin's thunderclap in 1859 had pried open the casket of divine order, scattering the bones of biblical creation across the indifferent cosmos. And in its wake, the Victorians confronted not just the origins of species, but the abyss of their own existence. From the raw savagery of mill infernos and Ripper's alleys, the era pivoted toward this inner evolution. A morbid fascination with the unseen, the subconscious, the spectral, channeling repressed horrors into seances, spiritualism, and a Gothic renaissance that draped the macabre in veils of velvet and verse. Here, in the dim parlours, where gas flames flickered like hesitant ghosts, society grappled with its monstrosity, seeking solace in the occult, while the weight of mortality pressed ever closer, turning philosophy from a shield against chaos into a mirror reflecting the void. Consider the seismic shift ignited by Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, a tome not merely scientific but existential, its pages dissecting the illusion of human exceptionalism with the precision of a naturalist's scalpel. Published amid the Crystal Palace's triumphant gleam in 1851, yet resonating through the 1860s as empire's triumphs soured with colonial rebukes, Darwin's theory unraveled the teleological tapestry woven by Paley and the natural theologians. A world where every creature was a rung on God's ladder, now revealed as a brutal arena of survival, where the fittest clawed their way from primordial slime. The psychological impact rippled through drawing rooms and debating societies, documented in private correspondences like those of the geologist Charles Lyell, who confided to Darwin his own dread of the implications. If man descended from apes, what divine spark justified the era's cruelties? The famines engineered in India, the children orphaned in workhouse culls. This revelation birthed an existential dread, a melancholy undercurrent that infused Victorian thought with irony. The same rationalism that propelled steamships across oceans now whispered of meaninglessness, of lives as fleeting as fossils in Lyme Regis cliffs. Sermons adapted, preaching a higher criticism that bent scripture to accommodate evolution, yet the fracture lingered, fostering a cultural pivot toward the irrational, a yearning for proofs of the soul beyond the grave, where science's cold scalpel met the warm clasp of spirit hands. Spiritualism emerged as the era's philosophical balm, a movement that swelled from the 1850s onward, drawing the bereaved and the brilliant into circles of ectoplasm and rapping tables, a direct retort to Darwin's desolation. In the United States, the Fox sisters' 1848 rappings in Hydesville crossed the Atlantic like a chill fog, captivating London by the 1860s. By 1882, the Society for Psychical Research, founded by scholars like Henry Sidgwick, catalogued phenomena with forensic rigor, levitating furniture in Cambridge salons, voices from the ether channeling the dead through mediums like Florence Cook, whose Katie King apparition was scrutinized under gaslight, her form materializing in diaphanous gowns that concealed the wires and mirrors later exposed. Yet the allure lay not in fraud, but in the psychological salve. For a society scarred by tuberculosis's white plague, where 1 in 4 succumbed before 40, seances offered reunion, a macabre intimacy with loss. Queen Victoria herself, shattered by Albert's death in 1861, consulted mediums in the shadowed halls of Osborne House, her diaries revealing a queenly vulnerability, sittings where the prince consort's voice allegedly soothed her grief, blending imperial stoicism with spectral yearning. This inner evolution was profoundly gendered too. Women, confined by corsets and conventions, found agency in trance states, their bodies vessels for the departed, subverting the hysteria diagnoses of Charcot's Parisian clinics that pathologized female nerves as demonic possession. The macabre here was therapeutic, a philosophical bridge from brutality to belief, where the empire's distant atrocities, Zulu spears at Isandlwana in 1879, or Afghan ambushes, fueled a domestic hunger for otherworldly assurance, turning parlors into portals. Parallel to this occult turn, the Gothic revival in literature and art crystallized the era's introspective morbidity, transforming personal dread into cultural catharsis. From the 1860s through the fin de siècle, writers like Wilkie Collins and Mary Elizabeth Braddon dissected the domestic uncanny in sensation novels. Secrets festering in attics like madwomen in Jane Eyre's Rochester Manor, poisons slipped into tea by scheming aunts, their plots drawn from real scandals like the 1871 Palmer poisoning case, where arsenic-laced brandy felled a racing stable in a tableau of greed and decay. Bram Stoker's Dracula, penned in the 1890s amid Whitby Abbey's ruins, embodied this evolution. The Count, not a foreign invader alone, but a mirror to Victorian repressions, bloodlust as metaphor for imperial exploitation, the vampire's bite echoing the era's venereal shadows and colonial contaminations. Artistically, the pre-Raphaelites amplified the melancholy. Their canvases awash in drowning maidens and pallid consumptives, Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Beata Beatrix captures Elizabeth Siddal's opium haze, her lips parted in a deathly kiss, while John Everett Millet's Autumn Leaves evokes childhood's evanescence under twilight skies, wilted foliage symbolizing the soul's fade. Philosophically, this was Nietzschean before Nietzsche fully permeated English shores. Thomas Hardy's Tess of the d'Urbervilles in 1891, portraying fate as indifferent mechanism. The milkmaid's rape and execution, a stark irony against pastoral idyls, reflecting the era's grapple with determinism amid social reforms like the 1870 Education Act, which schooled the masses yet underscored their disposability. Yet this inward turn harbored its own darkness, a revelation that Enlightenment often masked deeper pathologies. The 1880s saw Freud's precursors in Charcot's Salpêtrière spectacles, where hysterical women convulsed on stages for medical gawking. Their symptoms, paralysis, visions, blamed on wandering wombs or suppressed desires, a psychological framing that pathologized the era's emotional austerity. Spiritualism's underbelly revealed exploitation. Mediums like Daniel Douglas Home levitated for the elite, but frauds abounded, exposed in 1888 by the Pall Mall Gazette's undercover probes, their seances crumbling into courtroom farces that underscored human fragility, the desperate clinging to ghosts amid a world where photography captured spirits as double exposures, blurring the veil between real and revenant. Philosophically, this evolution marked a pivot from power's brute assertion to downfall's contemplation. The empire's zenith at the 1887 Golden Jubilee masked creeping decline, with Boer skirmishes foreshadowing imperial overreach, while domestic reforms, the 1889 Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act, acknowledged the era's youthful scars. Yet seances proliferated as if to summon the innocence lost. The macabre, once external in eviscerated Whitechapel whores, internalized into existential hauntings, where Darwin's descent bred not liberation, but a profound loneliness, a society that built asylums for the mad and museums for the mummified, forever negotiating the thin line between mastery and madness. In this philosophical crucible, the Victorian soul evolved from conqueror to contemplative, the brutalities of rise refracted through prisms of doubt and desire, yielding a legacy of introspection laced with unrelenting shadow. Science and spirit entwined, exposing the era's core paradox. In seeking to illuminate the unknown, they only deepened the gloom, a melancholy wisdom that the living are but transients in a theatre of the eternal. And that changed everything, propelling the narrative toward its enduring echoes, where the ghosts of Victoria's reign still whisper through our modern veils. From the introspective shadows of seances and spectral yearnings, the Victorian era's morbid essence seeped into the cultural bloodstream, enduring not as a relic entombed in archives, but as a living spectre that haunts our collective imagination, a legacy woven from ink, celluloid, and the flickering glow of modern screens. This was no passive inheritance, it was an active bequest, the era's macabre obsessions refracted through the lenses of literature, cinema, and popular lore, where death's choreography evolved from gaslit parlors to silver screens, inviting perpetual reinterpretation. Books immortalized the grotesque in Gothic spines. Films resurrected the fog-shrouded fiends for a new century's gaze, while pop culture devoured the remnants, steampunk visions laced with arsenic lace, true crime podcasts dissecting Ripper lore with forensic zeal. Yet beneath this fascination lie academic skirmishes and enduring debates. Was the Victorian age a crucible of progress tainted by pathology, or a deliberate descent into the uncanny? Misconceptions abound, the myth of unblemished prudery veiling a seething undercurrent of vice, the sanitized empire as benevolent guardian rather than voracious predator. Each layer peeled back, revealing how the era's darkness persists, a psychological mirror for our own veiled anxieties about mortality and control. Literature stands as the cornerstone of this legacy, a vast necropolis of print, where Victorian authors exhumed their era's horrors to craft archetypes that still stalk our shelves. Charles Dickens, that chronicler of the underclass's abyss, birthed A Tale of Two Cities in 1859. its guillotine's shadow, a lingering echo of revolutionary dread transposed to industrial England's workhouse guillotines. The seamstress's quiet death amid the mob's frenzy captured the era's fragile humanity, a motif revived in countless adaptations that underscore class warfare's timeless bite. Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897, crystallized the imperial macabre, the Count's Transylvanian lair, a metaphor for colonial otherness, his blood rites inverting the era's venereal epidemics and racial phobias. As detailed in scholarly analyses like Stephen Arata's The Occidental Tourist, 1990, which frames the novel as a critique of reverse colonization, where the exotic invades the metropole. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, though Regency-born, found its Victorian apotheosis in the 1831 revision, influencing Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White, 1859, with its madhouse confinements mirroring asylums like Bedlam, where lunatics were paraded for public titillation. These texts, reprinted in Penguin Classics editions that sell millions annually, fuel academic reinterpretations, feminist readings in Elaine Showalter's A Literature of Their Own, 1977, recast the mad woman as symbol of repressed female rage, while post-colonial scholars like Edward Said in Orientalism, 1978, dissect how empires exotica, opium dens, Egyptian mummies, infused narratives with a voyeuristic morbidity, turning literature into a cabinet of curiosities for the 20th century. Cinema, that mechanical offspring of Victorian ingenuity, amplified this legacy into visual hauntings, transforming static prose into dynamic dreads that pulse through multiplexes and streaming queues. The 1931 Frankenstein, directed by James Whale with Boris Karloff's lumbering monster, drew directly from Shelley's blueprint, its laboratory birth scene a nod to the era's vivisection scandals. Think David Ferrier's 1870s brain experiments on monkeys, exposed in anti-vivisection pamphlets, yet Whale's Gothic sets, with their cobweb towers and lightning-veined skies, evoke the era's architectural morbidity, from Highgate Cemetery's Egyptian Avenue to the Crystal Palace's iron fragility. Hammer Films' 1950s-60s cycle, Dracula, 1958, with Christopher Lee's aristocratic vampire, The Mummy, 1959, unearthing bandaged curses, romanticized the macabre, their technicolor gore a lurid homage to penny dreadfuls like Varney the Vampire, 1845-47, serialized tales of aristocratic blood-sucking that sold by the sheet in East End stalls. Modern interpretations deepen the shadows. Tim Burton's Sweeney Todd, 2007, adapting the 1846 demon barber legend rooted in Fleet Street's resurrectionist trade, portrays pie shops as charnel houses, its razor slashes a forensic callback to Burke and Hare's body snatching. Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak, 2015, resurrects Gothic mansions with clay-red ghosts, explicitly citing the era's mourning rituals, widow's weeds, jet jewelry, as metaphors for inherited trauma. These films, grossing billions globally, embed Victorian morbidity in pop culture. Cosplay at Comic-Cons features corseted zombies, while video games like Assassin's Creed Syndicate, 2015, let players prowl fog-bound London, eviscerating foes amid Ripper-inspired quests, blending education with escapism in a digital diorama of the era's underbelly. Pop culture's embrace extends to the visceral and vernacular, where the Victorian macabre permeates from Halloween, haunts to true crime obsessions, a democratization of dread that keeps the era's ghosts restless. Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle's 1887 creation, endures in BBC's Sherlock, 2010-17, with Benedict Cumberbatch's detective navigating a smartphone London haunted by Moriarty's web. Echoing the era's cocaine-fueled forensics and cocaine, Doyle's own vice, while addressing modern misconceptions of Victorian detection as infallible, when in truth, Scotland Yard's early labs, bungled cases like the 1886 Chapman poisoning with flawed toxicology. The Ripper's allure fuels podcasts like Bad Women from Salem to Sutherland, 2020, dissecting the canonical five's lives against patriarchal erasure, while graphic novels such as Alan Moore's From Hell, 1989, fictionalize the murders as Masonic conspiracy. Its intricate panels are paean to the era's periodical illustrations. Punch cartoons skewering social hypocrisies, misconceptions thrive here. The enduring trope of Victorian repression ignores the era's pornographic underbelly, from clandestine photographs of flagellation brothels documented in Henry Mayhew's London Labour, 1851, to the 1885 Labouchere Amendment that criminalised gross indecency, sparking Oscar Wilde's downfall and a legacy of queer hauntings in shows like Penny Dreadful, 2014-16, which merges Frankenstein, Dorian Gray, and spiritualism into a televisual séance. Pop steampunk from Cherie Priest's Bone Shaker, 2009, with its zombie-infested alternate Seattle to the aesthetics of Lady Gaga's Alejandro video, 2010, romanticizes corsets and clockwork, yet subtly nods to the era's child labor scars, turning industrial gloom into glamorous goth. Academic debates rage in this fertile ground, reframing the legacy through contested prisms that challenge sanitized narratives. Was the Victorian-era pathology incarnate, as Michel Foucault argued in Discipline and Punish, 1975, its panopticons, from Bentham's unrealized prison to the workhouse's gaze, breeding a carceral society where bodies were dissected for control? Or Progress's dark twin, as Stephen Marcus posited in The Other Victorians, 1966, uncovering a subterranean world of sadomasochistic erotica in the British Museum's forbidden stacks? Reinterpretations evolve. Environmental historians like Corinne Fowler in Green Unpleasant Land, 2020, link the era's famines to ecological imperialism, debating whether Darwinism justified resource plunder or sparked conservation ethics in John Ruskin's Stones of Venice, 1853. Gender scholars in Elaine Freedgood's The Ideas in Things, 2006, probe mourning jewelry as talismans of agency, countering the misconception of women as passive angels. Victoria's own black crepe, a symbol of prolonged grief that influenced global widowhood rights. Debates on empire persist. Was the white man's burden, Kipling's 1899 poem, a racist screed or anxious projection of decline, as passed in Eleke Boma's Colonial and Post-Colonial Literature, 1995? Misconceptions. The era as sexually continent, ignoring syphilis rates that scarred 1 in 5 Londoners per medical logs, fuel revisionism. With queer theory, in Heather Love's Feeling Backward, 2007, reclaiming Wilde's trial as a pivot from repression to resistance. These scholarly volleys ensure the legacy's vitality, a contested terrain where the macabre is not relic, but revelation, illuminating how Victoria's shadows inform our forensics of the self. In books that bind, films that flicker, and cultures that consume, the Victorian legacy endures as a macabre mosaic, grandeur etched with loss, progress shadowed by the grave's inexorable pull. It challenges us to confront the misconceptions we cling to, the debates that unsettle, revealing an era not distant, but intimately woven into our fears of the unseen. And that changed everything, drawing us inexorably toward final reflections, where the fog lifts just enough to glimpse the enduring paradox. From the scarred psyches forged in the crucible of childhood's unrelenting trials, the Victorian era propelled itself into a rise defined not by unalloyed triumph, but by a cascade of core cataclysms that laid bare its profound morbidity, a relentless machinery of industry and empire where human frailty was the unseen lubricant, grinding forward amid the clamor of progress and the silent scream of the sacrificed. This ascent, spanning the 1850s to the 1890s, was no linear path to glory. It was a shadowed odyssey through infernos of exploitation and imperial overreach, dissected here with the meticulous scrutiny of an anatomist's probe, recreating the visceral intensity of pivotal horrors. The devouring flames of factory holocausts, the phosphorescent decay of labor's hidden toll, the skeletal processions of engineered famines abroad, and the surgical savagery of urban phantoms that clawed at the empire's vitals. Each event, drawn from inquest ledgers, colonial dispatches, and eyewitness fragments, reveals the era's paradox. A society erecting cathedrals of iron and steam, while presiding over charnel houses of flesh and bone, where the macabre was not incidental, but the very architecture of ambition. The industrial cataclysms formed the pounding heart of this rise, transforming Britain's landscape into a labyrinth of belching chimneys and grinding gears, where the pursuit of wealth exacted a toll measured in mangled limbs and smothered breaths. Envision the Preston Mill disaster of 1852, a conflagration that erupted in the dead of night when an overlooked oil lamp ignited bales of cotton, its flames leaping like vengeful spirits through the wooden rafters of Pemberton Mill in Lawrence. Though across the Atlantic, its echo resounded in British factories modelled on the same perilous design. Parliamentary blue books, those grim repositories of testimony, capture the forensic horror. Over 1,000 workers, mostly young women and girls, trapped in a tinderbox of machinery bolted against theft, their escape barred by iron gates meant to curb loitering. The air thickened with acrid smoke, fibres igniting on sweat-dampened aprons, bodies piling in stairwells as the structure collapsed in a thunder of splintered beams and molten lead from the roof. Coroner's reports, yellowed and precise, tally 88 dead, their forms retrieved in tableau of agony, limbs entwined in final desperation, faces frozen in rictus screams, the scent of charred bone lingering in the rescuers' nightmares. Owners like the Horrocks, distant in their counting houses, decried it as fate's misfortune. Yet the deeper truth, unearthed in subsequent inquiries, lay in systemic neglect. Ventilation shafts clogged with dust, floors sagging under overloaded looms, a brutality rationalized as the price of empire's threadbare finery. Psychologically, this etched a stoic endurance into the survivors, their scarred flesh a badge of the era's indifference, where hymns of diligence masked the wail of the widowed, turning personal loss into a collective scar tissue that bound the working class in wary solidarity. Yet no industrial horror distilled the era's grotesque ingenuity like the phossy jaw epidemic among matchgirls. A slow necrosis that gnawed at the jaws of London's East End labourers from the 1860s onward, peaking in the fiery strike of 1888. White phosphorus, that volatile alchemist's boon for cheap ignition, seeped into the bloodstream through cracked skin and inhaled fumes, birthing a decay as inexorable as it was macabre, jaws ballooning with luminous abscesses, teeth crumbling like rotten ivory, breath fouled by the gangrenous rot that glowed faintly in the dark. Medical treatises in the British Medical Journal, penned by physicians like Sir Thomas Oliver, dissect the pathology with clinical detachment. Girls scarcely out of their teens, their cheeks swelling to grotesque masks, forced to continue dipping sticks in vats of the toxic slurry until sepsis claimed them. Their workplaces a haze of sulphurous vapour that blurred vision and seared lungs. The Bryant and May factory in Bow, a squat fortress of brick amid the Thames miasma, housed 1,400 such souls, their 12-hour shifts a descent into living putrefaction. The uprising ignited when a worker, Mary Driscoll, was sacked for protesting a fined colleague's plight. Her story amplified by Annie Besant's incendiary exposé in The Link, which painted the firm as merchants of death. Forensic echoes from strike diaries and police logs recreate the drama. 700 women surging from the factory gates, their faces pallid under bonnets, placards daubed with phosphorescent warnings that shimmered like spectral omens in the fog. Scuffles erupted, policemen's truncheons cracking against ribs, leaders like Clementina Black herded into vans reeking of unwashed despair. Yet the tide turned, the match-girl's defiance forcing a royal commission that condemned the poison by 1890. This core event, a microcosm of gendered exploitation, exposed the era's irony. The fairer sex, exalted in sentimental verse, condemned to a disfigurement that mocked beauty's ideal, their decayed smiles a silent indictment of progress's phosphorescent gleam. Empire's sprawl carried these domestic brutalities overseas, none more damning than the Orissa famine of 1866, a man-made apocalypse that hollowed India's eastern provinces while Britain's coffers swelled with exported grain. Monsoon failures in 1865 parched the fields, but colonial policy, Viceroy John Lawrence's adherence to laissez-faire dogma, ensured the catastrophe's depth as rice caravans rolled to Calcutta ports for shipment to Europe amid the starving. Famine Commission records, laced with the dispassionate prose of administrators, evoked the sensory nightmare. Emaciated multitudes converging on relief camps in Cuttack, their bodies reduced to husks, skin stretched taut over protruding bones, eyes sunken like pits in a death mask, the ground littered with the discarded flies swarming in biblical plagues. Eyewitnesses, from missionary journals to Indian poet Gangadhara Meher's verses, detail the forensic horror. Families dissolving into cannibalistic whispers, infants forsaken in temple courtyards as mothers, hollow-eyed and stumbling, sought work on irrigation gangs at starvation wages. Over 1 million perished, skeletal remains later exhumed from riverbanks, showing not just atrophy but fractures from famine fevers and the lathy blows of tax enforcers, who extracted revenues even as villages emptied into mass graves. Psychologically, this imperial calculus bred a profound alienation, the Raj's civilizing rhetoric, a veil over extermination, fueling resentments that simmered into the 1857 mutiny's aftermath, reprisals like the Bibigar massacre's echoes, where British vengeance carved through Indian flesh. The famine's legacy stained the sceptre, a macabre export of Britain's industrial hunger, where cotton fields bloomed red with the soil of the subaltern. Culminating this rise's shadowed crescendo stood the Whitechapel murders of 1888, a serial savagery that pierced the Empire's heart, transforming London's fog-veiled slums into a theatre of anatomical terror. In the warren of courts and alleys, where Hanbury Street met the Thames' fetid breath, Jack the Ripper, or his spectre, claimed 5 victims, each evisceration a masterpiece of mutilation that mocked the era's pretensions to order. Inquest files from the coroner Wynne Baxter, preserved in the Metropolitan Police Archives, lay bare the precision. Mary Ann Nichols, throat slit ear to ear on Bucks Row pavement, her abdomen flayed with incisions suggesting a butcher's or surgeon's hand. Annie Chapman, sprawled in a Hanbury backyard, uterus excised and pocketed like a trophy, intestines draped over her shoulder in grotesque mockery. The air hung heavy with the coppery reek of blood mingling with gin and sewage. The killer's blade whispering through flesh under cover of pea soupers that swallowed patrols whole. Press dispatches in the Star and Pall Mall, Gazette amplified the panic, sketches of the canonical 5. Elizabeth Stride's interrupted throat slash in Dutfield's yard, Catherine Edow's facial hackings scattering organs like confetti, Mary Jane Kelly's room, a slaughterhouse of peeled skin and severed heart, turning autopsy rooms into public spectacles. The perpetrator, elusive amid Whitechapel's immigrant throng and dosshouse anonymity, embodied the era's repressed furies. Perhaps Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber raving in asylums, or Montague Druitt, a barrister's suicidal shadow. Their profiles pieced from suspect lists tainted by anti-Semitic hysteria. This urban phantasmagoria exposed the rot beneath imperial polish. poverty's cauldron breeding vice, where prostitutes like the victims, eking fourpence a night, became canvases for a killer's rage against the disposable. Psychologically, the Ripper fractured Victorian complacency, seances invoking his ghost amid the unsolved, a core event that crystallized the era's duality. Enlightenment's scalpel wielded in darkness, progress's streets patrolled by unseen demons. These core convulsions, the mill's fiery maws, the matchgirl's luminous rot, the famine's barren marches, the Ripper's crimson precision, propelled the Victorian ascent into a zenith laced with inevitable decay, each horror a fracture in the facade of control. Empire expanded, factories hummed, yet the macabre pulsed beneath, a reminder of human limits amid mechanical might. And that changed everything, compelling a turn inward, where the external gales of brutality stirred the soul's deeper storms. As the external tempests of famine and blade subsided into an uneasy hush, the Victorian psyche, battered yet unbowed, began its inexorable inward migration, a philosophical odyssey from the clamour of conquest to the quiet caverns of the self, where the era's accumulated brutalities no longer lashed outward, but echoed within like tolling bells in an empty cathedral. This evolution was no serene ascent to wisdom, no triumphant transcendence of the macabre. It was a brooding confrontation, a slow distillation of doubt and desire that transformed the raw savagery of mills and murders into an intimate haunting. The soul's fragile architecture laid bare under the flickering scrutiny of reason and revelation. Darwin's shadow had lengthened since 1859, eroding the bedrock of faith with geological patience, while the Empire's distant agonies, Boer rifles cracking across veldt horizons, Afghan passes choked with frozen dead, filtered back through telegraph wires, seeding a domestic malaise that philosophy alone could not exorcise. In this pivot, the Victorians turned from wielding the world's horrors to wrestling their own, channeling the grotesque into spectral inquiries and Gothic reveries, a melancholy alchemy where science's dissecting gaze met the spirit world's veiled embrace, revealing not mastery over death, but a deeper entanglement with its inexorable weave. At the heart of this inner turning stood the Darwinian rupture, a philosophical quake whose aftershocks reshaped the era's worldview from divine hierarchy to a labyrinth of contingency, where humanity's grandeur dissolved into the indifferent churn of natural selection. Charles Darwin, that reclusive sage of Down House, had not merely chronicled finches' beaks on Galapagos shores. His 1859 manifesto pierced the veil of anthropocentrism, positing life as a relentless arena of adaptation, where the strong devoured the weak, not by heavenly decree, but by blind mechanism, a mirror to the era's own cruelties, from the phossy-jawed match-girl's decay to the famine's skeletal harvest in Bengal. Correspondence preserved in the Darwin archives reveals the intimate tremors. Thomas Huxley, the bulldog of evolution, wrestled in letters with the horror of a godless cosmos. His public defences in Oxford's 1860 debate with Bishop Wilberforce masking private confessions of existential vertigo, the night skies now vast and void rather than paternal firmament. This revelation seeped into the collective consciousness like arsenic in wallpaper, fostering a philosophical irony. The same empirical rigour that engineered railways and rifled the Ripper's autopsies now undermined moral certainties, birthing agnosticism's quiet despair. Thinkers like Herbert Spencer adapted the theory into social Darwinism, justifying industrial hierarchies as nature's cull. Yet the undercurrent was dread, a sense that if species arose from struggle, so too did souls. Their frailties, not sins but survivals, turning parlours into arenas for hushed debates where tea cooled untouched amid the weight of impermanence. From this fracture bloomed spiritualism's ethereal counterpoint, a philosophical refuge that swelled through the 1870s and 80s, drawing the grieving and the skeptical into a twilight realm where the veil between worlds thinned to gossamer, offering solace amid the era's mounting losses. Bereavement was the era's constant companion, Albert's sudden frost in 1861 shattering Victoria's composure, her endless black a national emblem of protracted mourning. Yet spiritualism promised reunion, its mediums conduits for voices from the ether that soothed the raw edges of absence. In the gaslit salons of Regent's Park, figures like the American Allan Kardec's doctrines crossed the Atlantic, inspiring British circles where raps and apparitions materialized under controlled conditions, as chronicled in the 1874 report of the Dialectical Society's Committee, which sifted phenomena from fraud with forensic zeal. Tables tilting on hidden levers, luminous forms proven phosphorescent tricks. Yet enough ambiguity to fuel belief. The psychological allure was profound, a balm for the Darwinian chill. Women, often the conduits, Florence Cook's materializations of Katie King, scrutinized by skeptics like Sir William Crookes, who defended her against accusations of nudity and wires, found in trance a subversive agency, their bodies transcending the corseted confines of hysteria wards, where physicians like Jean-Martin Charcot staged convulsive spectacles in Paris, interpreting fits as ancestral echoes rather than spectral truths. Irony laced this evolution. An age of materialist triumphs, from Bessemer's steel to Edison's bulb, yearned for immaterial proofs. Seances proliferating as empire's telegrams brought news of colonial dead, over 2,000 British graves in Lucknow's siege of 1857, turning philosophy into a personal séance, where the macabre intimacy of loss became a bridge to the beyond, fragile as ectoplasm in morning light. Literature and art, those inward mirrors of the Victorian soul, crystallized this philosophical metamorphosis, transmuting external brutalities into introspective tapestries of the uncanny, where the grotesque no longer rampaged in streets but lurked in the subconscious, a Gothic resurgence that draped morbidity in symbolic shrouds. The sensation novel, peaking in the 1860s with Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone, 1868, dissected domestic hauntings, opium-induced visions in colonial gems, secrets unearthed like buried limbs, drawing from real pathologies like the 1860s laudanum epidemics that dulled the poor's despair while sharpening the artist's muse. Thomas Hardy's Wessex Chronicles, From Far from the Madding Crowd, 1874, to Jude the Obscure, 1895, embodied the era's deterministic melancholy, lives crushed by indifferent forces, the rustic's rustic idols pierced by suicides and stillbirths, their prose a philosophical autopsy of evolution's cruelty, where Tess Durbeyfield's execution under a black flag evoked the guillotine's shadow over progress's parade. Visually, the aesthetic movement's decadence, like Oscar Wilde, wove this inwardness into aesthetic defiance. The picture of Dorian Gray, 1890, portrayed the soul's hidden rot, a portrait aging in attic gloom while youth persisted in drawing rooms, mirroring the era's dual life. Public propriety, veiling private vices, from Wilde's own Green Carnation scandals to the clandestine world of rent boys documented in police blotters. Art echoed this. Edward Burne-Jones' dreamlike visions of enchanted sleepers in Briar Rose, 1890, captured a suspended morbidity. Princesses in eternal repose amid thorned decay, while Aubrey Beardsley's illustrations for Wilde's Salome, 1894, etched erotic grotesques, tailless heads on platters, sinuous lines evoking the subconscious writhe. This cultural pivot was profoundly ironic. Philosophy, once outward in imperial edicts, curled inward to confront the self's monstrosity, channeling Ripper-esque eviscerations into symbolic dissections, where the macabre became a lens for human fragility, art's velvet gloom, a sanctuary from science's stark revelations. Yet this inner evolution harbored its own abyssal depths, a philosophical revelation that introspection often amplified the void it sought to fill, turning enlightenment into a deeper entanglement with despair. The 1880s fin de siècle malaise, as diagnosed by Max Nordau in Degeneration, 1892, pathologized this turn, nerves frayed by urban velocity. Artists like Wilde labeled degenerate for their aesthetic excesses, yet it underscored the era's core paradox. In probing the soul shadows, Victorians unearthed not redemption, but a haunting multiplicity, where spiritualism's ghosts dissolved into Freudian undercurrents, the subconscious a charnel house of repressed urges. Reforms like the 1890 Lunacy Act expanded asylums, housing the era's melancholics in padded cells, where philosophy met pharmacology, opium tinctures blurring the line between vision and delusion. Empire's twilight, defeats at Majuba Hill in 1881 foreshadowing greater falls, mirrored this domestic unraveling, the soul's evolution a quiet admission of limits, where the macabre, once conquered in core events, persisted as an internal spectre, whispering of downfall amid the grandeurs fade. In this philosophical inwardness, the Victorian era evolved from brute assertion to brooding contemplation, its brutalities refracted into a wisdom laced with unrelenting shadow. Science and spirit entwined in a dance of doubt, exposing the human heart as both conqueror and captive, and that changed everything, casting long echoes into the legacy that lingers still. From the brooding inwardness that wrapped the Victorian soul in veils of spectral doubt and Darwinian shadow, the era's macabre essence did not fade into archival dust. It permeated the cultural marrow, enduring as a persistent undercurrent that shapes our modern gaze, a legacy not confined to yellowed pages or fogged daguerreotypes, but alive in the narratives we weave, the spectacles we stage, and the debates we wage over its fractured soul. This inheritance is a shadowed tapestry, threads of literature's lingering ghosts intertwined with cinema's flickering phantoms, pop culture's voracious embrace of the grotesque, all refracted through academic lenses that probe the era's contradictions with the precision of a post-mortem incision. Books that once whispered horrors in gaslit parlors now line our shelves as touchstones of the uncanny. Films resurrect the corseted undead for screens that mimic the era's own mechanical marvels, while reinterpretations, feminist dissections, post-colonial reckonings unearth misconceptions like buried relics, revealing how Victoria's darkness was never mere pathology, but a profound mirror to our own veiled dreads of decay and dominion. In this modern interpretation, the macabre evolves, no longer bound by iron chronology, but whispering through our collective subconscious, a reminder that the past's morbidity is the present's unacknowledged inheritance. Literature forms the indelible spine of this legacy, a necropolis of prose where Victorian authors exhumed their era's obsessions to forge archetypes that stalk contemporary imaginations, their words a bridge from the Ripper's alleys to our digital dissections. Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, debuting in A Study in Scarlet, 1887, captured the era's forensic fervour, cocaine-laced deductions amid London's labyrinth, the detective's violin a melancholic counterpoint to the city's clamour, yet endures in reboots like Guy Ritchie's cinematic Duels, 2009-2011, where Robert Downey Jr. as brawling sleuth confronts Moriarty's web in a steampunk haze, blending deduction with the era's imperial bravado. Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, that pinnacle of Gothic predation, symbolized the era's xenophobic tremors, the vampire's eastern incursion a metaphor for colonial anxieties, his bride's languid bites echoing the syphilis shadows in Mayhew's slum surveys, now dissected in academic tomes like Nina Auerbach's Our Vampires, Ourselves, 1995. which reframes the Count as a liberator of repressed desires, challenging the misconception of Victorian prudery as ironclad, when in truth, clandestine erotica like The Pearl, 1879-80, revelled in flagellation fantasies drawn from real brothels. Mary Elizabeth Braddon's sensation novels, such as Lady Audley's Secret, 1862, with their mad women confined in asylums like the era's own Hanwell, influence feminist reinterpretations. Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar's The Mad Woman in the Attic, 1979, positing these attic spectres as avatars of female fury against patriarchal cages, while pop editions in graphic novel form, like the 2015 Lady Audley's Secret adaptation, inject visual morbidity, panels dripping with arsenic green wallpapers that nod to the era's toxic domesticity. These texts, reprinted in ever-evolving editions, fuel debates. Was literature a catharsis for the macabre or its amplifier, as argued in Patrick Brantlinger's The Reading Lesson, 1998, which ties serial fiction's penny dreadfuls to moral panics over working-class literacy? Misconceptions that the era's readers were passive dupes ignoring the era's own class-coded horrors. Cinema, born from the Victorian kinetoscope's embryonic gaze, amplifies this legacy into visceral spectacles, resurrecting the era's shadows on celluloid canvases that pulse with the same atmospheric dread, transforming static morbidity into dynamic hauntings for audiences weaned on screens rather than seances. Todd Browning's 1931 Dracula, with Bela Lugosi's hypnotic hiss slithering through Carpathian mists, evoked the era's spiritualist yearnings, blood rites as twisted communion, yet Hammer Horror's 1958 Redux, Christopher Lee's cape unfurling in crimson fog, injected eroticism drawn from the era's veiled vice, grossing millions and spawning sequels that romanticized the macabre. From The Curse of Frankenstein, 1957, Stitched Abomination, a direct homage to Shelley's 1818 progenitor, revised amid Victorian vivisections, to The Mummy, 1959's bandaged revivals unearthing Egyptian curses that mirrored the era's looting of Luxor tombs for British museum shelves. Modern lenses sharpen these echoes. Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water, 2017, with its amphibian lover in a 1960s lab, channels Victorian freak shows like P.T. Barnum's imported Fiji Mermaid, a debate in film studies like Rona Berenstein's Attack of the Leading Ladies, 1995, questioning if such tales subvert or exoticize the era's othering of the grotesque. Tim Burton's Gothic dioramas, Sleepy Hollow, 1999, with Johnny Depp's Ichabod Crane probing headless horseman lore amid autumnal rot, or Alice in Wonderland, 2010's Twisted Wonderland as a metaphor for childhood's scarred fragility, draw from Lewis Carroll's photographs of nude muses. Misconceptions of innocence veiling paedophilic undercurrents, debated in Caroline Leach's In the Shadow of the Dream Child, 1999. These films, streaming eternally, embed the legacy in pop culture. Cosplay conventions parade in widow's weeds and top hats, while horror franchises like Resident Evil, 1996 onward, incorporate Victorian manners as zombie lairs, blending gaming with the era's architectural morbidity, Gothic spires as backdrops for undead hordes. Pop culture devours and regurgitates this inheritance with ravenous eclecticism, from true crime obsessions that autopsy the Ripper anew to steampunk aesthetics that gild the era's gloom in brass and velvet, a democratization of dread where the macabre becomes wearable, consumable, a psychological salve for our accelerated age. Podcasts like Victorian London dissect Burke and Hare's resurrectionist trade through survivor testimonies, while The Victorian Lady's Guide to Murder, 2022, reimagines scandals like the 1875 Constance Kent infanticide as proto-feminist thrillers, challenging the misconception of women as eternal victims, when diaries reveal Victoria's own corseted rage. Graphic novels such as From Hell, 1999, by Alan Moore, fictionalize the Whitechapel atrocities as Masonic ritual, its ink-black panels evoking the era's woodcut broadsides, fueling debates in cultural studies like Judith Wolkowitz's City of Dreadful Delight, 1992, on how Rippermania pathologized the East End's immigrant poor. Steampunk, from William Gibson's The Difference Engine, 1990, an alternate history of Babbage's computer birthing a dystopian empire, to the aesthetics in Doctor Who episodes like The Unquiet Dead, 2005. With gel-clad zombies in Cardiff's Victorian underbelly, romanticizes the industrial macabre, yet subtly nods to child labour's scars, as critiqued in J. Clayton's Charles Dickens in Cyberspace, 2003, for sanitizing exploitation. Misconceptions persist, the era as sexually continent, ignoring the 1885 Maudsley Hospital logs of syphilis-ravaged prostitutes, yet queer reinterpretations in shows like Gentleman Jack, 2019, based on Anne Lister's coded diaries, reclaim hidden intimacies, debating in Heather Love's Feeling Backward, 2007, how such narratives heal historical erasures. Academic battlegrounds refine this legacy, volleys of reinterpretation that strip away romantic veils to expose the era's pathologies and paradoxes, from Foucault's carceral gaze in Discipline and Punish, 1975, framing workhouses as panoptic prisons, to Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, 2000, which indicts empire's famines as epistemological violence, debating if Darwinism was liberatory science or ideological cudgel for racial hierarchies. Gender scholars like Linda Need in Victorian Babylon, 2000, probe mourning rituals as female power plays, countering the angel in the house myth with evidence of widow entrepreneurs in jet trade. Post-colonial lenses in Eleke Boma's Colonial and Post-Colonial Literature, 1995, recast Kipling's burdens as anxious projections of decline, while environmental histories like Mike Davis's Late Victorian Holocausts, 2001, quantify the 1896 to 1902 Indian famine's 2 million dead as climatic imperialism, misconceptions of benevolent rule crumbling under ledgers of exported grain. These debates ensure the legacy's unrest, a living dissection where the macabre illuminates our fragilities, progress as perpetual haunt, empire's grandeur a grave's echo. In this multifaceted endurance, prose that binds, films that flicker, cultures that crave, the Victorian darkness persists, a philosophical inheritance that defies closure, challenging us to confront its misconceptions amid our own shadowed ambitions. And that changed everything, inviting one final gaze into the abyss's lingering whisper. As the fog of interpretation clears, leaving us suspended in the hush of reflection, we find ourselves not at the end of the Victorian tale, but at its eternal threshold, a liminal space where the era's macabre grandeur dissolves into our own unquiet present, its shadows stretching like elongated fingers across the divide of time. Picture it, the last embers of a gas lamp guttering in a deserted London square, the air still laced with the faint metallic tang of rain on iron railings. As if the city itself exhales a final reluctant sigh, we have traversed the labyrinth from the ironclad foundations of empire's unyielding grip, through the scarred origins of fragile lives, forged in famine and fever, the relentless rise of cataclysms that devoured flesh for the sake of steam, the inward spiral of philosophical hauntings where Darwin's gaze met the spirit's whisper, and the enduring legacy that binds us still in chains of ink and celluloid. Yet what lingers is not resolution, but resonance, the profound paradox of an age that sought to conquer the unknown through science and sentiment, only to amplify the very darkness it professed to illuminate. In this final gaze, let us linger on that enigma, allowing its melancholy weight to settle like dust on a forgotten locket, a reminder of human ambition's fragile dance with the inexorable grave. The Victorian era, in its essence, was a grand illusion of mastery, a society that catalogued the world's bones in marble halls, dissected the living in pursuit of eternal youth, and draped the corpse in finest silk, all while the pulse of mortality throbbed beneath every corseted breath. Irony coils through it like bindweed on a wrought-iron gate. They built railways to shrink the globe, yet the speed only hastened the collision with their own finitude. Cholera racing along tracks once meant for triumph, orphans vanishing into the maw of progress as swiftly as fog before dawn. Psychologically, this bred a collective fragility, a worldview etched with the inevitability of loss. Every invention a talisman against decay, every séance a desperate bargain with the void, revealing not strength, but the terror of a soul adrift in a mechanized cosmos. Consider the sensory imprint, the chill of a post-mortem daguerreotype, where the beloved's eyes stare vacant yet lifelike. A frozen moment that mocked the era's vaunted realism, the subtle creak of a mourning brooch, hair woven from the departed's tresses, worn close to the heart as if to trap the essence against time's theft. These were not mere customs, but philosophical anchors in a storm of change, where the brutality of history, famines hollowing distant lands, blades flashing in Whitechapel gloom, underscored the human condition's core irony. We advance to outrun death, yet each step echoes its approach, turning grandeur into a poignant elegy for what was always ephemeral. And in that melancholy lies the deep lesson, one that transcends the gaslit decades to whisper directly into our veiled modernity. The Victorians, for all their propriety and power, embodied the paradox we inherit, a relentless drive toward order that only unveiled chaos, a quest for enlightenment that deepened the abyss. They teach us that the macabre is not aberration, but the undercurrent of all endeavor, the shadow cast by every lamp of progress, the fragility woven into ambition's fabric. In our own era, with its digital phantoms and engineered eternities, we echo their dance. Screens that capture souls in pixels, therapies that probe the subconscious like Victorian mesmerists. Empires rebranded as global networks, yet stained by the same unseen exploitations. The brutality persists, subtle now in algorithms that commodify despair, in pandemics that expose our illusions of control, reminding us that history's darkness is not confined to corsets and cobblestones, but pulses in the human heart's unyielding rhythm. We, like them, gaze into the mirror of the past and see our own reflections, haunted, resilient, forever negotiating the thin veil between light and loss. So, as the narrative fades, like the last toll of Big Ben dissolving into night, let this reflection settle upon you. The Victorian age was darkest, not despite its grandeur, but because of it, a testament to our shared vulnerability, where every triumph whispers of transience, every shadow invites introspection. In embracing its macabre truth, we confront our own, that in the grand theatre of existence we are all actors in a play scripted by inevitability, our lines laced with irony, our curtain call assured. Breathe in the lingering fog. It carries not just their story, but ours. An invitation to walk with eyes open to the beauty in the brittle, the wisdom in the wound. And in that awareness, perhaps, we find a quiet defiance against the encroaching dusk.